Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, John Meuret looks ahead to USDA estimates on acres and stocks. Justin McMechan describes possible wheat stem maggot damage to corn. Alan Corr explains how Operation S.A.F.E helps aerial applicators test spray patterns. And Daren Redfearn talks about the optimal time to cut grass hay. John Meuret from Meuret Grain Company in Brunswick, Nebraska is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. Ratings from the U.S. Department of Agriculture show the 2017 corn and soybean crops mostly holding steady ahead of the agency's June 30th reports on grain stocks and acreage. Those estimates, scheduled for release at 11 a.m. Central Time Friday, will tally corn and soybeans on hand as of June 1st and project how many acres of each farmers planted this season. Prices for both commodities have been struggling to gain traction. The July corn futures contract after Wednesday's close was its lowest since the first of the month, while July soybeans were the weakest since May 30th. We talked with John Tuesday afternoon from Norfolk about markets leading up to Friday's reports, but we began by asking about current conditions in his area of northeast Nebraska.
Jeff, we're a little dry. I mean, everybody's grumbled a little. There was a little rain late last week come through, but it was pretty spotty in nature, and I think everybody's ready for a good ½ inch to an inch, soak us up a little bit. So overall, not bad, but could use a rain.
Which areas of the country do you think are receiving the most focus right now?
You know, I think there's two main focuses, and to me, the biggest one is North Dakota and South Dakota and their dryness. The second area is probably going to be Eastern Corn Belt. They got a really late start because it was overly wet, and now they have gotten a little more rain to soften things up again. So,
how heavily do you think Friday's reports either are or will weigh on markets?
Well, the reports are always movers, Jeff, and it's been extremely calm. You know, even though it feels like they've been big moves, historically they haven't been. Next week's report's going to be a mover. You know, we're going to get to see the fresh acres again. Certainly the funds have lightened up and have made themselves somewhat neutral. So you'd have to expect that whatever the numbers are, the funds will come in guns a-blazing.
Do you believe the USDA will make a noticeable change on acres?
I don't. I don't think there's going to be much change at all. The farmer had his mind made up, and I think he's stuck with that for the most part. Maybe a little bit more prevent plant acres, but I think what we have for prevent plant were extra acres to begin with. So the net's going to be not a big change.
How useful will that stocks number be with a little bit of a price rally here in June?
I think it's still a viable number. I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at that. Certainly some bushels moved off the farm into commercial hands, but ownership, both on the farm and in the commercial, are still relatively large for this time of year.
So from your perspective, what has demand been like from the end user?
I still say soft, Jeff, and part of the problem is it was a big crop to begin with. And the other problem is that we're in Nebraska, so the Nebraska bushels are going to be some of the last bushels that get exported out of the country or used in ethanol. So we are using corn, it's getting cleaned up from other cheaper origins, and then they'll come to Nebraska.
Describe that export demand.
It's routine. You know, I don't think there's anything real special about it. You're doing some Asian business, you're doing some Mexican business, very much front loaded. You know, corn is cheaper today than it is in 3 months and 6 months and 9 months, and so we've changed from 2 years ago going hand to mouth to maybe buying ahead a little bit. So it feels good, it's just not enough to get rid of the carry out yet.
What about those export competitors, specifically Brazil?
Brazil last week got really close to U.S. corn competition going to Asia, Japan specifically. but the Brazilians just keep cheapening it up to make sure they can get that business. So we thought we were going to be in the driver's seat for about a day, and then Brazil says, no, we're going to sell that corn. So they are quite aggressive.
Is the slump in crude oil prices a danger to ethanol?
I think definitely, Jeff. I think gasoline underneath $2 over a period of time is going to be a danger. We know we're going to blend 10%. Can we get it to that 15 levels up to the people in DC? Crude oil is going to hurt us, and that discretionary blending, that last piece of the blending, is the key until they change the mandate.
How much of an impact do those price fluctuations have on ethanol margins?
You know, I think big. I believe if crude oil's down underneath $40, you're going to see some slowing of some ethanol plants. And you already have contracted the margin substantially the last 60 days. If we continue to see that slide, I think we'll darken some other plants. And we don't need that. We talked about demand, and we need ethanol to stay strong.
All right, let's talk about your price outlook. First in corn, where do you think the market goes?
I don't think anywhere, Jeff. I think we're stuck in the same range that we've been for 6 months. We maybe thought 10 days ago we'd perk up a little bit, and it tried on the back of wheat. And I just don't think it's got enough muster to go. We've had an extremely large change of ownership from the funds back to the farmer to the commercial. And now I think we sit still and wait for something else to drive us. So that's my corn outlook. We're sideways for 60 days here.
What does that mean for possible selling strategies?
I think you got to sell forward. You stretch out, and if you sell a year from now and you can sell futures above $4, you do it. And I think if you sit and do nothing, you're going to be selling, spot futures at $370 to $380.
And your outlook for soybeans?
Soybeans, I want to be a little friendly. We have raised a mammoth crop. South America's raised a mammoth crop, and yet we still have soybeans that are relatively high in the big scheme of it. So I think we're going to see something sometime this summer to give us a rally on beans, and I would estimate $1, $1.50. So we may go to 9 before we go to 10.5, but I think it's going to make that move.
And finally, John, to wrap up, tell me how basis has been moving in your area.
It's just done nothing, Jeff. It has been so quiet. We saw a little seasonal increase in late May, and then it softened up from there. You just got too much corn around, and demand is too soft. So we hope that it can continue to appreciate somewhat through the summer, but it doesn't look good.
Next week, University of Missouri Extension ag economist Scott Brown will join us to look at cattle markets. Some Nebraska corn growers have noticed insect damage this season in very particular situations from what could be an uncommon pest. The environments are all similar in that they feature corn which was planted green into a rye or wheat cover crop. Nebraska Extension personnel believe wheat stem maggot is the cause of the injury, but you'll hear in a minute why they can't yet definitively confirm that thought. Nebraska Extension's Justin McMechan joined us Monday to further describe the issue.
On May 30th, we got a few phone calls on producers that had rye cover crops or wheat cover crops that they green planted corn into. And initially when we got the calls, they were saying they were seeing dead heart symptoms. So some insects were being isolated from these. They weren't sure what they were. So we went out to those and saw a range of damage from 2 to 30%. But essentially we were finding these little maggots in these plants. And so we brought them back, and we've been dissecting those plants and trying to determine what's going on.
Can you further describe the damage in those fields?
Yeah. So initially when we got out there, I mentioned the dead heart symptoms. But then later, when we were back about 2 weeks later, we were seeing this excessive tillering. And these plants really hadn't grown much. They remained pretty stunted. And so a lot of more calls started rolling in then because it was evident from the field what they were seeing. Initially, these were some keen consultants that were seeing just the first signs of what was happening.
And what do you see when you bring them back to campus here?
Yeah. So it's a lot of fun trying to isolate wheat stem maggots, or what we think is wheat stem maggot, from these plants. But basically, we cut the plants open, and we would find these maggots almost all the way down to the growing point, below the soil surface, so 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface. They're into that growing point, and they're more or less burrowing it out and feeding on it. And the result is the plant more or less loses that center. But it appears after they reach kind of their 3rd or 4th instar, they're moving back up the plant to complete their development, possibly in these corn plants. We have a lot of unanswered questions.
So what is the wheat stem maggot?
What is the wheat stem maggot? So the wheat stem maggot is commonly found in winter wheat fields. And in fact, if a grower is out in a field, and typically this time of year it's getting harder to tell, but they'll see these white heads in the field. Worked in western Nebraska for a couple years, and this is usually pretty low in number, 1% or so. We get up to 5%, I'll get a call from a grower. But it's a minor pest, really, in winter wheat. So this was a little bit surprising to find it in corn.
Describe the situations and the areas of the state that you notice this.
Yeah, so initially we were getting calls just from south central Nebraska, and lots of cases we were getting out to these fields, and it was confined literally to where the cover crop was. But then we started getting calls from other parts of the state. We posted this on Twitter, and as a result, we had a lot more people calling in. And so it seems like it's spread kind of through south central, through the eastern part of the state in a number of distinct geographic locations. But within the individual field, sometimes we just had a grower plant just a slope of the field with a cover crop. And so not the whole field planted, of course. And it was literally right to the edge of where the cover crop was. That was where the damage was. Outside of that, the plants were fine. So it's pretty clear to identify the cover crop association with it.
Any history of this whatsoever?
We've got reports from 2005 and 2015. Wayne Onesorg, an extension educator, actually took some documentation of it in 2015 on a single field that he was seeing it in. He followed the plants through to development. They didn't produce any grain. They more or less look like a non-competitive plant. National Crop Insurance Service would give that designation to those types of plants. And we're tracking plants on these. We're seeing a little bit different symptoms than what Wayne was seeing. And Wayne did rear out adults and identified them as wheat stem maggot. And that's why we're being a little bit cautious with these, because our symptoms are slightly different. Wayne said they were exiting or entering the plant almost at below the soil surface near the first node, whereas we're seeing them actually come in through the top and burrow their way down the plant. So it's possible it's environmental related on why that's occurring if we're dealing with the same insect. But the symptom of development seems similar after a little while.
Will you clarify why you're saying if we're dealing with that, or why it's hard to?
We're being a little cautious because this particular family of flies is really hard to identify as an immature. And we have Jim Kalish here on campus who's an expert in insect identification, and he cautioned us to wait until we get some adults out for emergence to make sure that we're dealing with the same thing. We want to be really sure what we're dealing with so that when we go into future studies we know what we're working with.
Management options?
No management options this year. So this has been a tough conversation with growers. These fields, as I mentioned, got up to 30% in some cases. Nothing they can do. And I know there's a bit of revenge out there because of the small insect is causing all this damage. But they've already done their damage within those plants. We don't expect them to move between plants. We actually expect the adults will complete development and leave the fields. I really recommend to growers going into next year to terminate these crops 2 to 3 weeks in advance, the rye cover crop or wheat cover crop prior to planting corn. It's unfortunate in the eyes of what people want from cover crops, which is they want to grow them right up to the last minute. So hopefully we can provide some management options if they run into those types of situations in the future.
You can find more background about the issue in Justin's recent Crop Watch article. We'll link to that on the Market Journal homepage. As crops grow taller and the season matures, it's not uncommon to see a low-flying airplane dive and rise over fields in Nebraska. Those aerial applicators apply products to help protect and manage plants, doing it faster and on a larger scale than a ground-based sprayer could. To make sure those planes are achieving efficiency and uniformity, Operation S.A.F.E helps test planes across the U.S. S.A.F.E stands for Self-Regulating Application and Flight Efficiency. Alan Corr is one of the analysts who travels the country to help pilots check their aircraft. He's also served as the education director of the Nebraska Aviation Trades Association and previously worked for Nebraska Extension. We recently met up with Alan near Henderson, Nebraska, where we saw how the process works.
Essentially, we have the equipment to test what's coming out of that airplane, where it's landing, the volume that's hitting where, actually the uniformity of the pattern and the proper pattern width.
And why is that beneficial for a pilot?
It's got a lot of benefits to it. Number one, knowing the proper swath width to fly, so you're not overlapping too much, and so you're not leaving skips in the field is certainly beneficial. If you are flying too narrow of a path, it might look okay in the field. You might not have any yield loss from any of that. But at the same time, it's more efficient to take the most efficient, widest swath width that you can within reason to make that flight more efficient.
So describe the testing that you did today.
Testing that we did today and testing that we do all of the time, we put out a string and we put a fluorescent dye, a rhodamine type dye, in the aircraft hopper, add water. We've got tripods at both ends, and we'll make several passes with that aircraft, each time rolling up the string. As he applies that fluorescent dye, it will land on that string. We also put out droplet cards that measure the droplet size, actually the volume mean diameter. We're looking for fine droplets also, a large number of fine droplets, could indicate that there could be a potential drift problem. Even though there's always potential drift problems, as you have more and more fine droplets, there's increased potential for drift.
When you put that into your computer then, what does it show you?
Actually, we read it through a spectrometer, and the actual pattern data that comes out, it will come close to pretty much showing you exactly where every drop hit within that pattern. From one end of the pattern, one side of the pattern to the other side of the pattern. And what we look for is, number one, a consistent low area or high spot where there's under application or over application going on within that pattern itself. Now, every pass is going to be a little bit different because of all the different variables that there are in aerial spraying. However, if we consistently see a low spot, a high spot, or some issue, that means that we need to make some adjustments to that equipment to fill in those spots or to reduce those high spots and make it a much more even pattern.
For a farmer out there, can you explain maybe the bigger differences between a land application and an aerial application?
Well, an aerial application obviously is a much quicker operation. Aerial application, they can work when ground application sometimes can't. Other issues might be, crop height, obviously. Ground application is going to be, a little less expensive. However, and I see it all the time driving down the highway where they use ground application on crops that have been drilled, you obviously have a yield loss there. And that yield loss most likely would more than pay for the application and the product by doing it with the aerial sprayer.
So what's the participation level in Operation S.A.F.E?
Well, within the United States, they do have a fair participation rate. I've been to a lot of other states as far as helping out with fly-ins and conducting fly-ins there. Some states it's a requirement. People go have their plane tested, just do a set of 3 or 4 passes just to satisfy that requirement. Others obviously go there and are totally interested in how their plane is performing or how their application is. Here in Nebraska, we have a tremendous participation. The Nebraska Aviation Trades Association has been instrumental in the past in trying to get members there. Years ago, 10, 15 years ago, didn't have much of a participation rate. BASF stepped in and offered to help out with this by conducting private clinics like we just did here today. John Garr with Garco Products also donates the dye. So it's virtually, other than their time, their fuel, and that, virtually free to the applicators in Nebraska, and most take advantage of it. And the applicators here, they take a big interest in trying new things. If they want to take a narrower swath to lessen that chance of any drift if they're doing herbicide work, and they want to try shutting off some outer nozzles. They want to try different deflections, or they want to try different products, deposition aids. We spend a lot of time doing that with these guys, and for example, I'll be at this place at maybe 3 or 4 times in 1 year. So again, in Nebraska, they're avid about doing the proper job for the producer and protecting the environment.
The Nebraska Aviation Trades Association says Operation S.A.F.E is a voluntary program in Nebraska. Operation S.A.F.E urges pilots to test their aircraft yearly, but it recommends aircraft should be tested after any major changes or, at a minimum, every 2 years. The June Nebraska farmer says when corn prices were higher, Marie Krausnick saw several new center pivot systems being installed, many with signs indicating they were GPS ready. Krausnick is the Water Department Manager at the Upper Big Blue Natural Resources District. This month's magazine says earlier this year, the Upper Big Blue launched a cost-share funding pilot program for variable rate irrigation systems in the district. You can read about the program in the June Nebraska Farmer. Nebraska Extension forage and crop residue specialist Daren Redfearn says for grass hay producers, only 2 management practices can be completely controlled: fertility and plant maturity. We talked with Daren recently about how those issues play into quality and output. We started by asking about trying to find the best time for harvesting hay.
So the optimum time for harvesting grass hay is relatively simple if you key in on one particular stage of grass growth. And that stage of grass growth is going to be somewhere in the boot stage, just prior to seed head emergence, or just immediately after those seed heads have emerged from the boot.
And why is that the optimum time?
So again, that's a pretty simple answer to a lot of physiological reasons why that happens. But the reason for harvesting at that particular stage of growth is right at that boot stage or early heading, especially when we're talking about a lot of our grass hays, yield at that point is not going to increase appreciably following that time frame. However, if we look at our forage quality is actually going to drop very rapidly after the seed heads emerge.
So how much does the nutritive value change?
You know, that's a little bit hard question to answer there. Some of that's going to depend on the species. For example, a lot of our small grains, it'll drop very rapidly. Crude protein may decrease 1% per day. TDN may be as high as 2% per day. If we look at a lot of our cool season forages, especially the smooth brome grass like we have over here in the eastern part of Nebraska, it may take 2 or 3 days to note those same changes. So the perennials tend to change quite a bit slower than the annuals.
What's the impact of fertilizer?
So the impact of fertilizer, basically what we rely on fertilization to do, not necessarily improve the quality as much as the yield. So nitrogen fertilization is going to increase yield quite dramatically. From a forage quality standpoint, nitrogen fertilizer is going to increase our crude protein. However, as we've talked about a little bit earlier, once those grasses reach that boot to early heading stage, that crude protein is going to go ahead and drop. So actually what you could have, if harvest is delayed quite a bit, you'll have a large yield of low quality hay.
Is forage analysis necessary?
Forage analysis, I would recommend forage analysis as being a necessary component from 2 standpoints. Number one, if you're feeding that hay, you're going to need to know what the protein and TDN is going to be in that hay. The reason is because if it's low, you're going to need to supplement it so that you don't impact animal performance. If it's not low and it meets the needs of the animal, there's no need to supplement additional protein and energy. So it's look at it as a cost savings.
So any hay that might have been cut across Nebraska recently and suffered a rain event, how important or noteworthy or critical is that?
Yeah, so the rain's always a tricky part. That's the things that we've talked about prior to the maturity and the fertilization. Those are the 2 factors that you can control during the haymaking process. You know, the weather is one uncontrollable factor, and it doesn't make any difference what part of the country you're from. I ran into this same things when I was in the southern part of the U.S. But the rain, hay that's harvested and rained on pretty quickly, at least to me, doesn't seem like it's damaged or you lose as much as it does hay that's been harvested and is about ready to bale. At that point, you have to go back in, you have to start handling that, tedding it and getting it busted back out in the windrow so that it can dry. And the more times that you handle that hay, the more losses that you have. And these losses are primarily associated with the leaves, which have all the energy and the protein in them anyway.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Precipitation in this last 7-day period was very sparse. Once again, the models overestimated the precipitation. The most concentrated area of precipitation that we've seen in terms of quantitative amounts was in the Tuesday-Wednesday time frame as we had some thunderstorm breakout across portions of southwest Nebraska. A lot of these were highly elevated thunderstorms. We didn't see a lot of precipitation at the surface. And the most concentrated areas across south central Nebraska. Outside of that, we've been pretty much warming up as the week progressed until that cold front come through on Thursday. Did generate a few scattered thunderstorms, but nothing that we were expecting. Most of the heaviest precipitation moved to the east of us, and now as we go into this weekend, we look like we're going to have fairly cool conditions. As we go to the upper air pattern, that trough has now moved to the east of us, is kind of bringing a northwest flow into our region, so we're seeing some fairly cool conditions for this time of the year, almost spring-like. High pressure system dominates all of the central and northern plains, as most of the activity is off to the east of us, and in fact we see the precipitation along this front that's projected, and this does incorporate the remnants of Tropical Storm Cindy that was incorporated with this troughing pattern. Now as we get into Sunday, the trough basically stays in the same position, high pressure firmly planted over top of us, so we're going to be looking at another cool day on Sunday. There is some signs of some precipitation breaking out. If it does, it's going to be very late in the day, and I really don't think much of this is going to hit the ground. As we go into Monday, this trough starts to deepen and the ridge in the west starts to build up, so we're going to start to see a return of warmer conditions as high pressure moves to the east of us, brings a southerly flow. A little bit more moisture gets evected into our region. We start to see some thunderstorms breaking out across western Texas and New Mexico. And then as we go into Tuesday, this trough starts to come in the Pacific Northwest, and that's going to help develop a surface low across the Dakota, southern Canada, and in fact that will help to feed up some moisture into the region, but it's going to be delayed. So most of it is going to be across the Pacific Northwest, and as this system moves in on Wednesday across the northern plains, now our flow is going to start to come up from the Gulf of Mexico with a couple surface area lows depicted across Dakotas and Kansas, and this will bring the moisture up and interact with the frontal boundary that's trying to move across the region, generating some very isolated thunderstorm activity, more concentrated to our north. Now as the system moves toward the western Great Lakes, we do see a much better chance as surface low over Texas will really pump the moisture up and interact with the boundary, and that should generate a fairly broad area of precipitation across Iowa, eastern portions of Nebraska, and then well to our north in Minnesota and the Dakotas. As we get to Friday, this system starts to move into the Great Lakes region. Surface low still remains in place across Texas. That will continue to feed the moisture up into the northern plains, and we should see some thunderstorms once again develop across Kansas, Iowa, and points to the north. Now as we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, we still keep this troughing pattern in place for the majority of the period. So the warmth will remain to the south of us. Nebraska is caught between the two systems. 8 to 14 day forecast shows us much above normal precipitation dry to our west. If we take this farther out, essentially the models at this point from next Thursday through the 8th of July are showing precipitation in almost every single day across Nebraska, but we still need to show us the money.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, possible wheat stem maggot damage, aerial applicator testing, and cutting grass hay. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Next week, Scott Brown will be our cattle market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.